The announcement arrived in Washington with the formality of a press statement, but the implications were immediate. The United States government confirmed new financial sanctions targeting the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. The measures were justified on grounds that the Colombian administration, according to the U.S. Treasury Department, had failed to adequately confront drug trafficking networks that continue to operate across Colombian territory. Alongside Petro, the sanctions extended to his wife, Veronica Alcocer, his son, Nicolas Petro, and Interior Minister Armando Benedetti, described as a central political figure within the administration. The sanctions involve the blocking of assets and financial transactions linked to the designated individuals within U.S. jurisdiction. Any property, funds, or accounts connected to them in the United States are to be frozen. Additionally, financial institutions operating under U.S. legal authority are prohibited from engaging with them in monetary transactions. The measures apply not only to banks, but to international payment systems that route transactions through the U.S. financial network. The decision is significant because Colombia is the world's largest producer of cocaine. And for decades, cooperation between Washington and Bogotá has centered on reducing cultivation, disrupting trafficking routes, and targeting the networks responsible for exportation. Colombia has long been a key ally in the United States' broader regional counter-narcotics efforts. As a result, the announcement of sanctions against a sitting Colombian president is unprecedented and marks a shift in diplomatic posture. The reaction from the Colombian president was direct. Gustavo Petro stated that he found the decision contradictory. He said he had opposed drug trafficking throughout his political career and that his administration had taken steps to redesign Colombia's approach to the issue. He dismissed the accusations that he had allowed criminal groups to expand their influence. Petro pledged that he would not retreat from his policies, stating that there would be not one step back in what he views as a process of national reform. The backdrop to the sanctions includes a broader shift in U.S. security posture in the region. The United States confirmed the deployment of an aircraft carrier strike group to reinforce operations against what Washington described as narco-terrorism networks active in Latin America. The timing of the deployment and the sanctions heightened perceptions that Washington intends to increase pressure on governments whose anti-narcotics efforts it considers inadequate or misaligned with U.S. objectives. At the core of the disagreement is the nature of Colombia's counter-narcotics strategy. Previous Colombian governments coordinated closely with Washington in strategies that focused on aerial eradication, law enforcement campaigns, and military support operations, particularly in remote regions where coca cultivation is concentrated. Petro's approach differs. His administration argues that eradication alone cannot solve the crisis. Instead, Petro has emphasized rural development, substitution programs, and negotiations with armed groups to reduce violence and weaken the economic drivers that support illegal markets. In public remarks, Petro has said that Colombia's historic strategies have intensified conflict in certain regions without resolving the underlying conditions that sustain illicit cultivation. He has pointed to concentrations of poverty, limited access to state services, and the absence of stable economic alternatives. Critics of his approach, however, including voices within the United States government, argue that the shift in strategy has resulted in reduced direct pressure on criminal organizations and has potentially enabled their expansion. The inclusion of the president's son and spouse within the sanctions announcement drew further attention. Nicolas Petro has previously faced legal scrutiny within Colombia involving allegations of illicit campaign financing. The Colombian judicial system continues to address those matters independently. The United States' decision to extend sanctions to Petro's family members underscores Washington's assertion that the issue extends beyond governmental policy into questions of influence and responsibility. Interior Minister Armando Benedetti, also sanctioned, has been a key political figure linking government institutions to legislative support. His role includes coordinating policy alignment between the president's agenda and congressional processes. Sanctioning a figure in such a central position indicates Washington's intent to apply pressure not only at the level of presidential authority, but also within the broader structure of the administration. In Bogotá, the announcement was met with statements from multiple sectors. Members of the government's political coalition denounced the sanctions as interference in domestic political processes. Opposition members expressed concern that the decision could affect Colombia's international financial relationships. Analysts noted that Colombia's economy relies in part on international credit markets, And while the sanctions do not target the state apparatus, any perception of instability could have secondary effects on investment conditions. Petro has maintained a relationship with the current US administration based on public dialogue and diplomacy. Despite disagreements over narcotics strategy, the two governments have coordinated on areas such as migration, climate cooperation, and economic development initiatives. The sanctions introduce a new dimension to the relationship that raises questions regarding ongoing bilateral agreements, including military cooperation frameworks. Washington's decision included public remarks from the US Treasury Secretary. He stated that criminal organizations linked to coca production have continued to operate with expanded territorial presence and that this constitutes a direct threat to regional stability. The statement asserted that the Colombian government has not employed sufficient measures to limit the operational freedom of those networks. The assertion is contested by officials within the Colombian government who maintain that security operations continue nationwide and that policy adjustments are intended to reduce violence rather than intensify confrontation without strategic benefit. The confrontation between the two governments also reflects broader geopolitical narratives. Petro has argued that criminal financing networks tied to cocaine distribution operate within global financial systems, including cities such as Miami. He has stated that enforcement must apply not only to cultivators and transporters, but to financial intermediaries who facilitate profit laundering. These statements challenge conventional frameworks that focus primarily on crop eradication and border interdiction. The debate is rooted in decades of history. Colombia's internal conflict involved armed groups, criminal organizations, and state security forces, each operating within complex territorial dynamics. Drug trafficking has provided funding for multiple actors. Efforts to demobilize insurgent groups have included transitional justice frameworks and integration programs. Petro himself participated in an urban guerrilla movement in his youth prior to its demobilization in 1990. His political career emerged within the context of the shift towards civilian political processes after demobilization. The United States has historically been a central partner in funding and training Colombian security forces. Programs such as Plan Colombia, initiated in the early 2000s, provided billions in aid aimed at reducing coca cultivation and strengthening state capacity. Evaluations of these programs indicate reductions in certain trafficking routes, but also note recurring patterns of re-expansion in remote regions. Petro's government contends that structural solutions must address land distribution, rural investment, and state presence in historically marginalized areas. Meanwhile, the public exchange between the two governments continues. US officials maintain that sanctions are a necessary response to insufficient anti-narcotics enforcement. Colombian officials criticize what they describe as punitive measures that do not address economic realities. Observers note that both governments face domestic political pressures. In the United States, the administration has emphasized border security and disruption of fentanyl networks, aligning enforcement narratives with broader domestic priorities. In Colombia, Petro's administration is pursuing social and economic reform initiatives, including healthcare and labor restructuring. The sanctions may influence political dynamics not only in foreign policy, but also within Colombia's internal debates. The deployment of the US aircraft carrier group adds a strategic military dimension to the situation. The stated mission is to reinforce operations targeting maritime trafficking routes in the Caribbean and the Pacific. These routes have long been used by criminal organizations to move narcotics toward international markets. Colombian authorities also engage in maritime surveillance operations, but jurisdictional coordination remains complex. The Colombian government has criticized certain US naval interdiction operations, citing incidents in which suspected trafficking vessels were intercepted with force, resulting in fatalities. Petro has argued that such operations can escalate violence and that alternative approaches could reduce the risks associated with maritime confrontations. The current situation, therefore, reflects multiple layers: diplomatic negotiation, military coordination, domestic political conflict, public messaging, and long-standing structural challenges. Neither government has indicated a willingness to reverse its position. Petro continues to assert that Colombia must change its approach to one that focuses on social investment and negotiated stabilization. The United States continues to assert that aggressive disruption of trafficking networks remains necessary to prevent expansion of criminal organizations. For now, communication channels remain open. Diplomatic representatives continue to hold discussions aimed at maintaining cooperation where shared interests align. The future of security collaboration will depend on whether the two governments can establish a framework that reconciles differences in strategy while preserving operational coordination. The Colombian president's statement affirming that there would be not one step back signals determination to continue his policies unabated. For Colombia, the challenge remains balancing internal reform, regional diplomacy, economic stability, and security priorities within a complex and evolving national landscape. For the United States, the decision reflects a recalibration of how it responds when allied governments adopt strategies that diverge from the established anti-narcotics framework. The situation remains ongoing, with political, economic, and diplomatic implications still unfolding. Monitoring will focus on subsequent negotiations, policy adjustments, and the practical impact of the sanctions on Colombia's governing institutions and on the bilateral relationship between the two nations.